This Marple and Murder on New Year's Eve. Good evening, friends, and welcome to another mystery here on Cafe Tales. I'm your host, Ali, and I'm so glad you're here. I'd love to know where in the world you are listening from, and what kind of weather is keeping you company tonight. Let me know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe for new stories each day. Now, let's begin tonight's adventure. Chapter 1. Garlands, tickets, and a chalk star. The assembly rooms at Market Basing had never looked quite so festive. Miss Marple reflected as she entered on the arm of her old friend. Lady Bant, a wide-op paper garlands in gold and silver looped across the ceiling in generous swags, catching the light from the chandeliers and throwing back 1,000 tiny gleams. Someone had gone to considerable trouble, she noted, and probably considerable expense as well. Dolly, how very splendid, Miss Marple murmured, her keen blue eyes taking in every detail of the transformed hall. Lionel Mark hamstowing mostly. Lady Bantry replied, waving a gloved hand at the decorations. He's funding the whole affair, new hospital wing, and all that. Thought he'd see in the new year with a proper bash. Though between you and me, Jane, I suspect young Clarissa had rather more to do with the actual planning. Miss Marple made a small non-committal sound. She had heard things about Sir Lionel Markham, naturally, in a village the size of St. Mary Mead, and with connections throughout the county. One could hardly avoid hearing things. A wealthy man, chairman of several concerns, a philanthropist when it suited him, and a man who had married Dagon quite recently, choosing a wife some 30 years his junior. The great clock face suspended above the days caught her attention. It was constructed of gilt paper and cardboard, surprisingly well made, with the numbers 1959 on one side of an arrow and 1960 on the other. Below it, on a sturdy tripod, sat the evening's piece de resistance, a brass cannon, stout and businesslike despite its festive purpose. Its mouth pointed toward the ornate plasterwork of the ceiling, a confetti cannon. Lady Bantry explained, following her gaze. Goes off at midnight. Silver streamers everywhere. Victor Dane's idea, I believe. He's the master of ceremonies, frightfully keen on theatrical touches. How very modern. Miss Marple observed mildly. They had arrived somewhat early, as was Miss Marple's habit when attending functions. She found that one learned a great deal more about an occasion by observing the preparations than by simply attending the finished product. Lady Bantry, who understood her friendless little ways, had made no objection to the early arrival. The hall was not yet crowded. A handful of committee ladies bustled about, adjusting decorations and conferring in urgent whispers by the entrance. A neat woman in a dark dress sat at a small table, arranging tickets and a cash box with methodical precision. Her hair was pulled back severely, and her expression suggested that frivolity, while perhaps necessary on such an occasion, was not a thing to be encouraged. That's Edith Vale. Lady Bantry whispered. Lionel's secretary runs his life, apparently. Everything from his appointments to his correspondence. Been with him for years. Miss Marple noted the way Miss Vale's fingers moved, quick and certain, as she arranged the tickets in neat rows. A capable woman, clearly the sort who would notice if something were out of place. A younger man emerged from the side passage, camera in hand, flash attachment gleaming. He had an eager, puppyish quality about him, the look of Simeon determined to make his mark. Hugh Rifford. Lady Bantry supplied. Local paper terribly keen on his photography. Uses those new flashbulbs. Give us several iron spots before their eyes. Mr. Rifford was indeed surveying the room with professional interest, occasionally raising his camera to frame a shot. though he did not yet fire off any of his flashbulbs. "Let's have a look of days, shall we?" Lady Bantry suggested. Before the crowd arrives and one can't move, they crossed the polished parquet floor, their footsteps echoing in the still half-empty room. The floor gleamed with recent attention, reflecting the lights overhead in long, wavering streaks. Someone had taken great pride in that polish, Miss Marple thought. As they mounted the low steps to the dais, Miss Marple found her attention drawn to the floor directly in front of the microphone stand. There, small but distinct in the warm light of the chandeliers, was a chalk mark, not a scuff or an accidental smudge, but a deliberate mark, to quick strokes forming a star. She paused, looking at it thoughtfully. "Something wrong, Jane?" Lady Bantry asked. "Just looking," Miss Marple replied. Her voice was mild, almost apologetic, but her eyes remained fixed on that small chalk star. It was the sort of mark one might make to indicate a position. She had seen similar marks in her nephew Raymond's theatre, placed on the stage floor to show actors exactly where to stand for the best lighting. But this was not a theatre. This was the assembly rooms at Market Basing, nearer to the cannon. She observed another mark in the otherwise perfect polisher-fane Thiel scuff cutting through the wax. In a short arc, fresh, she judged made within the last few hours, certainly. Arthur takes such pride in his flaws, Lady Bantry remarked, following Miss Marple's gaze. He'll be quite put out if he sees that mark. Arthur Bell, Miss Marple recalled, was the caretaker of the assembly rooms. She had encountered him once or twice, a punctilious man who spoke of the building's maintenance with the devotion others reserved for far grander subjects. I don't suppose Arthur would draw stars on his lovely clean floor, Miss Marple said. More to herself than to Lady Bantry, stars? Oh, that little chalk thing? Probably the decorating committee, Lady Bantry suggested. Measuring where to put things. You know, yes, probably, Miss Marple agreed, but her tone held a note of reservation. A man emerged from the back corridor tall and sleek, with an air of professional bonhomie that marked him as someone accustomed to managing events and people. His evening dress was impeccable, and he moved with the practiced ease of a dancer or an actor. "That must be Victor Dane," Miss Marple murmured. Dane was indeed surveying his domain, nodding with satisfaction at the decorations, the positioning of the band's instruments, the angle of the cannon. He caught sight of Lady Bantry and swept toward them with a broad smile. "Lady Bantry, how delightful! You're beautifully early, and this must be Miss Marple. I've heard such a great deal about you." He said this with a slight emphasis that suggested he had heard specifically about Miss Marple's involvement in certain matters that had puzzled the local constabulary. But his smile remained firmly in place. "The room looks charming." "Mr. Dane," Miss Marple said, "we do try. Sir Lion wanted something special. The cannon is rather a coup, don't you think? Hired it from a theatrical supplier in Birmingham. Arthur fetched it this afternoon, sealed and certified. All very professional. I'm sure it will be most impressive," Miss Marple said politely. She glanced back at the chalk star, now partly obscured by Mr. Dane's shadow as he shifted position. In her experience, people did not make marks on floors without reason, and caretakers, as she had observed, did not appreciate marks on their carefully polished surfaces. The doors at the far end of the hall opened wider, and more guests began to arrive. The committee ladies redoubled their efforts, and Mr. Rifford began to wander among the early arrivals, his flashbulbs popping intermittently. "We should find our seats," Lady Bantry suggested. "Yes, indeed." Miss Marple agreed, But as they descended from the dais, she cast one more glance at that small chalk star. Such a little thing, really to quick strokes, and yet she found herself thinking of something her old nurse used to say. X marks the spot. How very curious, she thought, that someone should feel it necessary to mark this particular spot. And how very curious that they should do so without troubling to inform the caretaker, who would surely have objected. Miss Marple settled into her seat beside Lady Bantry and arranged her small evening bag on her lap. The evening was just beginning, and already she found herself quite interested in how it would proceed. She did hope nothing unfortunate would occur, but experience, she reflected sadly, had taught her that where there were marks and preparations, and carefully laid plans, unfortunate events had an unsettling tendency to follow. The hall filled steadily with guests, their voices rising in cheerful conversation. The band began tuning their instruments, and on the dais their brass cannon waited, its mouth pointing upward toward the innocent ceiling, ready to shower silver streamers at the stroke of midnight. Miss Marple folded her hands and prepared to observe. Chapter 12. A Thump and a Fall. The evening progressed with all the predictable gaiety of a county New Year's celebration. Miss Marple, seated at a small table near the edge of the dance floor, watched the assembled company with the quiet attention that her friends had long since ceased to remark upon. Lady Bantry, less interested in observation than participation, had been claimed for 2 dances already, and was presently engaged in animated conversation with the wife of the local solicitor. Sir Lionel Markham had made his entrance at 9, a solid figure in evening dress, his face ruddy with good health and good living. He moved through the room with the assurance of a man accustomed to deference, pausing here and there to accept congratulations on the new hospital wing, to clasp shoulders, to laugh at jokes that were perhaps not quite as amusing as his slaughter suggested. His wife accompanied him, though Miss Marple noted that they did not remain together long. Mrs. Clarissa Markham was a striking woman, younger than Miss Marple had expected, with fair hair dressed in the latest fashion, and a gown that whispered money in every elegant line. She had a way of listening to people that suggested complete attention, though Miss Marple suspected that very little of what was said actually registered. It was a social skill carefully cultivated and quite effective. The band played creditably well. They were a local ensemble augmented for the occasion by a trumpet player from Brighton, and they managed the modern numbers with reasonable competence, while not entirely abandoning the waltzes that the older guests preferred. Dotmer, Victor Dane, as master of ceremonies, was everywhere and nowhere ensuring that introductions were made, that wallflowers found partners, that the buffet remained adequately supplied. He had changed his white gloves once already. Miss Marple noticed, though she could not imagine why one pair should have become unsuitable so quickly. Shortly before midnight, Mr. Dane mounted the dais and took possession of the microphone. The band ceased playing and conversations died away into expectant silence. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Dane's voice carried well-trained, no doubt, by years of similar occasions. As we approach seminal moments of 1959, I should like to invite our generous host, Sir Lionel Markham, to join me here and offer a toast to welcome the new year. Applause rippled through the assembly. Sir Lionel made his way to the dais with the measured tread of a man conscious of his dignity. Miss Marple watched him mount the steps and take his position at the microphone. Mr. Dane stepped aside, moving toward the cannon where Thelignard hung ready. Just there. Lionel, Mr. Dane called out cheerfully. Perfect spot for the toast. Everyone will see you splendidly. So Lionel adjusted his position slightly. Miss Marple, from her vantage point near the floor, could just make out the chalk star beneath his polished shoes. So that was its purpose? Someone had marked exactly where the speaker should stand. Right then, Mr. Dane continued, his hand now resting on Felon Yard. At the stroke of midnight, I'll fire our little cannon here, and we'll have streamers and celebration. Sir Lionel will give us the toast, and we'll all drink to prosperity and health in 1960. The lights dimmed. Someone had arranged this effect carefully, Miss Marple thought. The chandeliers reduced to a warm glow, leaving the gilt paper clock above the days illuminated by a single spotlight. Very theatrical indeed. The crowd began to count, their voices rising in that peculiar mixture of excitement and nostalgia that attends turning of a year. 10, 9, 8. Miss Marple found herself counting along, though quietly. Beside her, Lady Bantry had returned and was clutching her arm with unnecessary vigour. 7, 6, 5. Lionel stood very straight at the microphone, his champagne glass held ready. In the dimmed light, his face appeared almost sculptural planes and shadows. 4, 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year! The shout filled the assembly rooms. Mr. Dane pulled the lanyard with a flourish. The sound that followed was not quite what Miss Marple had expected. Instead of the soft pneumatic whoosh of compressed air, there was a thump sharp and somehow businesslike, and yet the effect was aspramized. Silver streamers burst from the cannon's mouth, showering upward and outward in a glittering cascade, catching the light as they fell. For a moment the scene was one of pure celebration. Streamers drifted down like metallic snow. People cheered, and the band launched into Auld Lang Syne with enthusiastic if slightly ragged timing. Then Sir Lionel Markham gasped. It was a small sound, barely audible over the general noise, but Miss Marple heard it. She saw his hand, the one not holding the champagne glass, move to his chest. The glass tilted, spilling champagne across the polished boards of the dais. Sir Lionel's knees buckled. He pitched forward slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, and collapsed onto the dais with a heavy, final sound. The music faltered. The cheering died. For several seconds, no one seemed quitable to comprehend what had occurred. Mrs. Clarissa Markham screamed a high, shocked sound that cut through the confusion. People surged forward. Dane stood frozen by the cannon, his hand still on the lanyard, his face blank with INCOMPREHENSION. Dr. Haddock, who had been standing near the buffet, pushed through the crowd with the purposeful haste of a medicolman confronted with an emergency. He knelt beside Sir Lionel, his finger seeking a pulse at the throat, then carefully turning the fallen man onto his back. Miss Marple, moving with less haste but equal purpose, made her way closer. Lady Bantry, for once, followed without commentary. Inspector Slack arrived almost immediately. He had been present at the celebration, though in plain clothes, and now he took charge with the brusque efficiency that characterized his professional manner. Everyone step back. Please give the doctor room. Dr. Haddock looked up, his expression grave. Hippocone slacked closer and spoke in a low voice, though Miss Marple, positioned carefully nearby, could hear most of it. Dead, I'm afraid. Very quickly, too. Look here. He indicated Sir Lionel's. The evening dress shirt, pristine white, showed a small mark just over the heart, not blood exactly. A bruise perhaps sounded its centre, a tiny tear in the fabric. Perfectly round. He shot, someone whispered. The whisper spread through the crowd, growing into a murmur of shocked acceptance. His heart gave out the excitement, his age. Miss Marple said nothing. She was looking not at Sir Lionel's body, but at the days itself. The streamers lay scattered every silver and cheerful, and entirely inappropriate to the moment. They had fallen in a rough pattern, radiating outward from where the cannon stood. She moved carefully, trying not to disturb anything until she stood just behind the days. She inhaled slow, her nose wrinkling slightly. Beneath the scent of champagne spilled down soaking into the wood, beneath the powder and perfume of the assembled guests, there was something else a sharp, acrid note sulphurous, not clean smell of fireworks, but something more industrial, something that spoke of propellant and combustion. Lady Bantry appeared at her elbow. "Jane, are you quite all right? You look very pale." "I'm perfectly well, Dolly. Just rather warm in here." But Miss Marple's eyes continued their careful survey. She noted the cannon, its brass mouth still pointing slightly upward, though not quite as steeply as she remembered from earlier in the evening. The metal was warm when she passed close by it, and there was a faint smudging around the muzzle dark against the polished brass. She looked up at the ceiling. The plasterwork was intact, unmarked nor scorch, no impact. The streamers had been designed to shower downward. That was clear. Yet that smell, that sulphurous tank suggested something more evolent than simple compressed air. On the carpet just ahead of where Sir Lionel had stood, she noticed a small scrap of paper, or not quite paper, cardboard perhaps. It was faded and singed at one edge, roughly circular. She bent down, her movement stiff but deliberate, and picked it up between two fingers. Inspector Slack was speaking in urgent tones to Mr. Dane, who seemed incapable of coherent response. Dr. Haddock had covered Sir Lionel's face with someone's dinner jacket, and was attempting to comfort Mrs. Markham, who had gone very white and still. Miss Marple slipped the small cardboard disc into her evening bag. Later, when the immediate crisis had passed and people were thinking more clearly, she would examine it properly. But already her mind was working, sorting through possibilities, discarding the improbable, focusing on the significant. She thought of the chalk star, of the cannon's position, of that sharp, unexpected thump. Lady Bantry touched her arm. "They're saying it was Hishart." Dr. Haddock seemed quite certain. "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "I expect that's what they're saying." But her expression as she gazed at the festive room, with its scattered streamers and its terrible stillness, was troubled. She had seen a great deal in her long life, and she had learned to recognize when things were not quite as they appeared. Some confetti, she reflected, has rather sharper edges than one might expect. The new year had arrived, but for Sir Lionel Markham Allier's had ended together on a chalk mark drawn by an unseen hand, beneath a brass cannon that should have been merely decorative. Miss Marple folded her hands and prepared to observe very carefully indeed. Chapter 3. Miss Marple notices. Sulphur under champagne. The assembly-rooms had taken on the hushed, uneasy atmosphere that follows sudden death. The band had packed away their instruments with unseemly haste. The committee ladies, so animated an hour before, now moved about collecting glasses and folding chairs, with the subdued efficiency of mourners at a funeral. Miss Marple remained seated at a small table, apparently resting, though her eyes missed very little. Lady Bantry had been swept up in the general exodus, shepherded away by well-meaning friends, who insisted she must be shocked, must need air, must certainly not linger in such a melancholy place. Inspector Slack had cleared a space around the days, posting young Constable Pike to ensure that nothing was disturbed. Dr. Haddock had accompanied the body to his surgery, promising a thorough examination despite his initial assessment of heart failure. Mrs. Clarissa Markham had departed in the care of her sister-in-law. Still pale and silent Victor Dane sat on one of the folding chairs. His theatrical composure entirely collapsed. His face had a greyish tinge, and his hands, Miss Marple observed, trembled slightly as he accepted a glass of water from Edith Vale. Miss Vale herself appeared unaffected by the tragedy, at least outwardly. She had resumed her position by the ticket table, methodically counting the evening's receipts, as though violent death were merely another attempt to be checked off her list of duties. Miss Marple found this composure interesting, not callous, precisely simply the reaction of a woman accustomed to managing crises without visible distress. Inspector Slack approached Miss Marple's table, his expression suggesting that he knew perfectly well she had not remained behind by accident. "Evening, Miss Marple. Terrible business indeed, Inspector, most distressing." Dr. Haddock seemed satisfied it was the heart. Natural causes man his age excitement of the evening. Slack paused, then added with less certainty, though, "There was that mark on his chest. Bit odd." "Quite," Miss Marple said mildly. "Quite round and neat, almost as if something had struck him." Slack grunted. "Says the heart itself could cause such a mark. Internal pressure, blood vessels. Medical matters I don't pretend to understand." Miss Marple rose carefully from her chair. "Would you permit me to look at the days once more, Inspector? I left my spectacles case somewhere nearby, and I'm quite blind without my glasses." This was not strictly accurate, as her spectacles case resided safely in her evening bag, but Slack nodded permission. "Mind you don't disturb anything, though I don't suppose there's much to disturb. Accident most likely or natural causes." Miss Marple made her way to the days with small, careful steps. She paused at the base of the steps, ostensibly searching for her spectacles case, but in reality examining the carpet with minute attention. The chalk star had been largely obliterated by footprints now, trampled in the confusion following Sir Lionel's collapse, but its position was still discernible, marked by a concentration of scuff marks and a faint residue of chalk dust. She moved closer to where Sir Lionel had fallen. The champagne had soaked into the wood, leaving a dark stain. Scattered around it were the silver streamers, no longer festive, beauty in the harsh electric light that someone had restored to full brightness. Miss Marple knelt down, her movement stiff with age but determined. Among these streamers, partially concealed by their metallic folds, lay several small fragments of paper. She picked one up delicately. It was not the tissue-thin confetti one might expect, but something thicker cardboard, singed at the edges, with fibers compressed and blackened. She transferred this to her evening bag alongside its companion from earlier. Rising with some effort, she moved toward the rear of the days behind the microphone stand and the now silent cannon. Here, away from the main thoroughfare of disturbance, the air held that sulphurous note more distinctly. She inhaled slowly, analyzing the scent with the same attention another woman might give to a complex perfume. Not fireworks. She had smelled enough fireworks in her time to know their particular character. This was similar, certainly, but heavier, more industrial. It reminded her of something her late father had once shown her at a building site, the smell of powder charges, US drive bolts into steel. The cannon itself stood innocently on its tripod, brass gleaming. She approached it cautiously, not touching, but observing. The mouth of the cannon was still faintly warm. She could feel the heat radiating from it. Around the muzzle, barely visible against the polished metal, was a dark smudging, not scorch marks precisely, more like the residue of incomplete combustion. She looked upward. The ceiling showed no mark whatsoever. if the cannon had fired with sufficient force to leave residue on its own muzzle. Surely the plasterwork above should show some impact, some scorch, some evidence of violence, unless, of course, the cannon had not been pointed quite so high as it appeared. Miss Marple's gaze travelled back to Sir Lionel's position, marked by that obliterated chalk star. She gauged the angle, the distance, perhaps 6 feet, perhaps 7. Young Mr. Rifford appeared at her elbow, making her start slightly. "Miss Marple, I say, are you quite all right? You're looking awfully thoughtful. Just wool gathering, Mr. Rifford, an old woman's privilege. Dreadful thing about Sir Lionel. I photographed him not 10 minutes before it happened. Can hardly believe he's gone." Rifford paused, then added hesitantly, "Inspector Slack asked me to develop my photographs from this evening. Evidence, he said, though I can't imagine what my pictures might show." "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "You photograph everything, I expect." "Rather. Got some jolly good shots of the decorations going up, the band setting up, people arriving. I took one of Sir Lionel on the days just before midnight and one of Mrs. Markham by Thebalcony." "The days before midnight?" "Yes. At about 11:57 Mundane was adjusting the microphone, I think, making certain everything was positioned correctly." Miss Marple felt a small flutter of interest. How very thorough of Mr. Dane. She glanced once more at the cannon, at the floor where the chalk star had been, at the ceiling and marked and pristine. Inspector Slack approached again, his expression suggesting impatience. "Found your spectacles, Miss Marple?" "Oh, how foolish of me. They were in my bag all along." She produced the case with an apologetic smile. "I'm becoming quite forgetful in my old age." Slack's expression suggested he doubted this very much, but he merely nodded. "Drive. Haddock will have his report by morning. Until then, natural causes seems the most reasonable conclusion." Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Most reasonable. But as she made her way slowly toward the exit, she paused once more by the days. From this angle, with a proper perspective, she could see exactly where Sir Lionel had stood, and exactly where the cannon's mouth had been positioned. The trajectory was not vertical, as one might expect for a device meant to shower streamers upward. It was angled slightly forward, only slightly, but enough perhaps to direct something other than paper toward a man standing on a chalk mark. She thought of the small cardboard disc in her evening bag, singed and compressed. She thought of the sulphurous smell, heavy and industrial. She thought of the neat, round bruise over Sir Lionel's heart. Some confetti, she had reflected earlier, as rather sharp edges, but perhaps it was not the confetti at all. Perhaps the confetti was merely decoration camouflage for something altogether more deadly. Miss Marple stepped out into the cold January air, her expression troubled. She would examine her findings more carefully at home in good light. She would wait for Dr. Haddock's report, and she would think very carefully indeed about cannons and chalk marks and the small, significant details that other people overlooked. For if her suspicions were correct, Sir Lionel Markham had not died of excitement or heart failure. He had been murdered with considerable cunning in a room full of witnesses who saw nothing at all. Chapter 4. The cannon that wasn't quite the higher. Miss Marple spent a restless night. She rose early, as was her custom, and after a modest breakfast, set about examining the small cardboard discs she'd collected from the assembly rooms. In the clear morning light, their nature became more apparent. They were not decorative and fitty at all, but practical items compressed and dense, with singed edges that spoke of considerable heat and pressure. She placed them carefully in a small box lined with tissue paper and set them aside. Evidence, she thought, though of what precisely remained to be determined. Lady Bantry telephoned at 9, full of news and speculation. "Jane, you'll never credit it. Dr. Haddock isn't satisfied with his initial examination. He's sending for someone from London, a specialist in these matters. Inspector Slack is in quite a state about it." "How very prudent of Dr. Haddock," Miss Marple replied. "One should always be certain in such cases. Between you and me," Lady Bantry continued, lowering her voice as though the telephone operator might be listening with particular attention, "there's talk that it might not have been natural causes after all. That mark on his chest, you know. Haddock found something when he examined the body more thoroughly. He wouldn't say what, but he looked very serious indeed." Miss Marple made a sympathetic noise. "I'm sure Inspector Slack will investigate most carefully." After the call concluded, Miss Marple collected her coat and handbag. She had several calls to make, and it seemed advisable to make them sooner rather than later. Her first stop was the post office, where Agnes Reed presided over stamps, parcels, and a considerable volume of village correspondence with equal efficiency. Miss Marple. "How dreadful about Sir Lionel," Agnes said at once. "I can hardly believe it. He seemed so robust, yes, most distressing. Agnes, I wonder if you might help me with a small matter. I'm attempting to trace a parcel that may have passed through here. Recently addressed to Mr. Victor Dane, I believe." Agnes required no further encouragement. Her memory for postal matters was encyclopedic. "Mr. Dane. Yes, indeed. He received a parcel 3 days ago, brown paper, rather small, posted from Birmingham. I remember because he seemed quite particular about collecting it promptly. Usually he has things sent to his office, but this one came here to the village post office. How interesting. You wouldn't recall the sender, I suppose?" There was a return address. "Let me think." Agnes closed her eyes, visualizing something. "Theatrical. Midland Stage Supply or similar. They use a particular sort of label, very professional looking." Miss Marple thanked her warmly and continued to her next destination. The assembly rooms stood quiet in the morning light, locked and shuttered. Miss Marple had anticipated this and had taken the precaution of mentioning to Inspector Slack that she wished to retrieve a glove she believed she had dropped. Slack, preoccupied with other matters, had provided a key. Arthur Bell, the caretaker, was within, mopping the floor with vigorous strokes that spoke of deep displeasure. Terrible business. Miss Marple. Terrible. And what it's done to my floors, all those people trampling about. I'm sure you'll have everything restored beautifully. Mr. Bell, I understand you collected the cannon yesterday afternoon. Bell paused in his mopping. That's right. From Mr. Dane's office for o'clock sharp. He'd had it delivered there from the hire firm, all sealed up proper with twine and one of them printed labels. Very professional. Did you notice anything particular about Thellable? Can't say I paid it much mind. Had the hire company's name on it, unofficial like. Bell frowned. Though now you mention it, the printing was a bit queer. One-off letters looked off, though I think it was had a sort of chip in it. Made it look odd. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. A chipped? Why, how very observant of you. Well, I noticed these things. Details matter. That's what I always say. She found Inspector Slack in consultation with Dr. Haddock outside the doctor's surgery. Both men looked grave. Miss Marple, Haddock greeted her. I suppose Lady Bantry has told you I'm not satisfied with my initial assessment. She mentioned you had concerns, more than concerns. When I examined Sir Lionel more carefully, I found something lodged in the fabric of his shirt pressed into the buttonhole he was wearing. A small disc of cardboard, singed at the edges. It had penetrated flower petals and was resting against his chest, embedded in the cloth. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and produced a small tissue-lined box. Similar to these, perhaps? Haddock examined the discs with professional interest. Remarkably similar. Where did you find them? On the days among these streamers. I thought them unusual for confetti. Slack took the box, his expression darkening. You're saying Sir Lionel was struck by something fired from that cannon. I'm saying nothing of the sort, Inspector. I'm merely observing that these items seem out of place among tissue paper streamers. Haddock nodded slowly. A blank cartridge fired at close range could kill a man. The wadding alone, if it's substantial enough, can act as a projectile. I've seen similar injuries in theatrical incidents, but the cannon was pointing upward. Slack protested. Everyone saw it, did they? Miss Marple asked gently, in dim lighting, with excitement and anticipation. Would anyone notice if the angle was slightly different from what they expected? A few degrees could make considerable difference at 6 or 7 feet. Slack was already moving toward the assembly rooms, purpose in every stride. Miss Marple and Dr. Haddock followed. Inside, Slack examined the cannon with new attention. The brass tube sat innocently on its tripod, but when Slack inspected the base, he let out a sharp breath. Look here. The mounting screws, they've been loosened and retightened recently, too. You can see fresh marks on the metal. He tested the cannon's movement. It swivels easily, capable of being angled in multiple directions, despite its apparently fixed position. And here, Miss Marple indicated the interior of the tripod head gun oil. Unless I'm mistaken, fresh by the smell. Arthur Bell, hovering anxiously nearby, shook his head. I never touched the workings. Mr. Dane said the hire firm had set it all up proper. I just fetched it and placed it where he told me. Slack turned to examine the label. Still affixed to the cannon's case, which stood in the corner. He studied it closely, then straightened with a puzzled expression. The wires chipped just as Bell said. That's odd. Why would a professional hire firm use a typewriter with damaged keys? Miss Marple spoke quietly. Perhaps because the label wasn't typed by the hire firm at all. Perhaps someone wished to make it appear as though the cannon came directly from Birmingham, sealed and certified, when in fact it had been opened and altered. But who would have access to do such a thing? He asked. Someone with time and privacy, Miss Marple suggested. Simula failure with mechanical devices? Someone who could create a convincing label and reseal the package, so that Murdoch Bell would suspect nothing when he collected it. She thought of the chipped wire that Arthur Bell had noticed. She thought of offices and typewriters, of careful planning and attention to detail. The cannon, she realized, had been tampered with before it ever reached the assembly rooms. The question now was by whom and how they had managed to substitute a lethal charge. For harmless confetti, Inspector Slack stood by the brass tube, his face set Ingram lines. This wasn't heart failure at all. This was murder, carefully planned and coldly executed. Yes, Miss Marple agreed softly. I rather think it was Chapter 5. Alibis, bibend, balcony and buffet. Inspector Slack established his temporary headquarters in the small committee room adjacent to the main hall. One by one, he summoned those who had been present at the fatal moment, methodically counting a timeline of movements between 11:40 and 10 minutes past midnight. Miss Marple, having been granted tacit permission to remain, sat unobtrusively in the corner with her knitting. Slack had learned somewhat reluctantly that her presence often proved useful in extracting information from witnesses who might otherwise be guarded. Mr. Victor Dane was the first to be interviewed. He had recovered some of his professional composure, though his hands still showed a tendency to fidget with his cufflinks. My movements? Perfectly straightforward, Inspector. I was everywhere as a good master of ceremonies. Should be checking that the band had their music in order, ensuring the buffet was adequately supplied, making introductions between 11:40 and midnight, specifically. Slack pressed. Dane considered. I spoke with Mrs. Coster about the ticket receipts at approximately 11:45. Then I circulated through the room. At 11:50, I was near the buffet, directing one of the waiters to replenish the champagne. At 11:55, I mounted the days to prepare for the countdown. I checked the microphone positioning, ensured Sir Lionel knew when to join me. At 11:58, I was at the microphone myself, announcing the countdown, and during all this time, you were visible to the guests constantly. That's rather the point of being master of ceremonies. Inspector, one must be seen to be managing things. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. You mentioned checking the microphone position, Mr. Dane. Did you adjust it at all? Dane looked slightly uncomfortable. I may have moved it a fraction. I'm rather particular about such details. The speaker needs to be positioned exactly right for the best effect. And Sir Lionel stood precisely where you indicated. Yes, I placed him carefully. One wants the spotlight to fall correctly. You understand? After Dane departed, Slack consulted his notes with a frown. Plenty of witnesses to his movements. He was hardly inconspicuous. Mrs. Clarissa Markham arrived next, composed but pale. She had clearly spent a sleepless night, though her dress and demeanour remained impeccable. Mrs. Markham, Slack began with uncharacteristic gentleness. I know this is difficult, but I must ask about your movements last evening. She nodded. I understand, Inspector. I spent most of the evening circulating among the guests. My husband preferred me to be sociable while he discussed business matters. A faint bitterness coloured her tone. At approximately 11:45, I was speaking with Mrs. Henderson about her daughter's upcoming wedding. Then I moved to the band area. The band area? Yes. I wanted to request a particular piece for the dancing after midnight. The band leader was very accommodating. We discussed it at some length. I believe it was nearly 11:55 when I finished speaking with him, and then he moved toward the balcony. The room was rather warm, and I wanted air. Mr. Rifford, the photographer, took my picture there just before midnight. I was holding one of the balloon strings. I remember it had come loose from the decoration. Slack made a note. You were on the balcony during the countdown. Yes, I could see the days clearly from there. I saw my husband mount the steps. I saw Mr. Dane prepare the cannon. Her voice wavered slightly. I saw him fall. After she left, supported by her sister-in-law, who had waited outside, Miss Marple remarked quietly, "A younger wife often finds herself in a difficult position, Inspector expected to be ornamental, while her husband conducts the business of living." Slack grunted noncommittally. Miss Edith Vale entered briskly, her manner suggesting this interview was an interruption to more pressing duties. Miss Vale, I understand you were managing the ticket receipts yesterday evening. Naturally, someone had to maintain proper accounts. Sir Lionel was most particular about such matters. Your movements between 11:40 and midnight? I remained at the ticket table until 11:45. Then I collected the cash box and took it to the office safe. The keys were in Sir Lionel's pocket, so I had to locate him first. That took several minutes. I secured the money at approximately 11:50 and returned to the main hall at 12:05. The incident had already occurred. You were absent. During the critical moment, Miss Fallis' expression remained unchanged. I was performing my duties. Inspector Sir Lionel insisted the receipts be secured before midnight. He didn't trust having large sums of money lying about during the celebration. Most prudent. Miss Marple murmured, "Tell me, Miss Vale, do you type Sir Lionel's correspond?" The question seemed to surprise her. I did, yes. All his business letters, labels for packages, that sort of thing. Why do you ask? Oh, mere curiosity. I noticed the label on the Canon case had a distinctive character chipped Y. Something flickered in Miss Vale's eyes too quick to identify. Sir Lionel's office typewriter does have that peculiarity. The Y has been damaged for months. He refused to have it repaired, said it was unnecessary expense. Arthur Bell provided his account with the earnest precision of a man who takes pride in exactitude. I positioned the Canon at the 30, just as Mr. Dane specified. Then I attended to the duties, polishing glasses, checking the cloakroom arrangements. At 11:40, I was in the kitchen overseeing the preparation of fresh champagne trays. Just before midnight, I fetched additional glasses from the storage cupboard. I was at the side door when the countdown began. You didn't go near the Canon again after placing it? No need, sir. It was all set up proper. Mr. Dane said the hire firm had loaded it ready to fire. Hugh Rifford bounded in with puppyish enthusiasm, apparently undaunted by the gravity of the situation. Inspector Slack, I've developed all my photographs from last evening. Thought they might be useful. He spread them across the table with evident pride. Miss Marple set down her knitting and examined them with interest. This one, Rifford indicated a sharp image, shows Mr. Dane on the days at 11:57. You can see him adjusting the microphone stand. And this one taken at 11:58 shows the days from a different angle. The Canon's position looks slightly different, doesn't it? The leg nearest the edge seems to have moved outward a fraction. Slack studied the photographs intently. You're certain of the times? Absolutely. I note them in my log for each exposure. Professional habit. Another photograph showed Mrs. Markham by the balcony, her hand delicately holding a balloon string. The image was slightly blurred, suggesting movement. Taken at 11:59, Rifford confirmed. She was adjusting the balloon decoration. It had sagged somewhat. Miss Marple picked up the photograph, holding it close to examine a detail. The balloon string appeared to have a small mark on it, a chalky smudge in it, where Mrs. Markham's gloved fingers grasped it, most illuminating. Mr. Rifford, you have quite an eye for detail. After the interviews concluded, Slack paced the small room with barely contained frustration. Everyone has an alibi of sorts. Dane was visible throughout. Mrs. Markham was with the band, then on the balcony. Miss Vale was securing money. Bell was fetching glasses, and yet Sumionet tampered with that cannon, loaded it with a lethal charge, and angled it to kill Sir Lionel. Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested mildly, the question is not who was near the cannon at midnight, but who had access to it earlier. Who could have prepared it in advance? Slack stopped pacing. You're thinking the murder was set up beforehand, that the killer simply let events take their course. A theatrical device. Inspector, everything positioned precisely, the victim placed on his mark, the weapon aimed and ready. All that remained was for someone to pull the lanyard in innocent good faith. But that means the killer didn't need to be near the cannon at the critical moment at all. Precisely, Miss Marple said softly, which rather changes the nature of our investigation, doesn't it? Chapter 6. A photographer's flash and a borrowed typewriter. Miss Marple spent the afternoon at home examining Hugh Riffert's photographs with a magnifying glass borrowed from her nephew Raymond's last visit. The prints lay spread across her sitting-room table, arranged in chronological order according to the times noted on their backs. Lady Bantry arrived at 4 o'clock as had been arranged by telephone. "Jane, you're looking positively detective with that magnifying glass. What have you discovered?" "Several interesting details. Dolly. Look at this photograph taken at 11:57. Mr. Dane is adjusting the microphone stand, moving it perhaps an inch to the left. I don't see why that matters. No, look at this one taken just 1 minute later. The microphone hasn't been moved again, but the Canon's tripod has shifted. See here the leg closest to the edge of the dais. In the first photograph, it sits firmly on Thebaud's. In the second, it's perhaps 2 inches further out. And there's that heel scuff in the polish that we observed yesterday." Lady Bantry peered at the images. Someone moved the Canon or someone adjusted their position while making final preparations, and a tripod shifted as a consequence. The movement is very slight, but it would be sufficient to alter the angle by several degrees. But Mr. Dane said he was at the microphone at that time. Yes, he did say that. Miss Marple set down the magnifying glass, and yet the photograph suggests someone was near enough to the Canon to disturb its position either deliberately or accidentally. Tonetto, another photograph there. Blurred image of Mrs. Markham by the balcony. This is equally interesting. Mrs. Markham is holding a balloon string. Can you see the mark on it just where her fingers grasp it? It looks like chalk dust. Precisely. Now, why would there be chalk on a balloon string? Lady Bantry considered. Perhaps someone chalked their hands and then touched the string. Or perhaps the string itself was chalked for some purpose. Do you remember, Dolly, the theatrical productions Raymond used to take us to? The stagehands would sometimes use chalked strings to mark sight lines, stretching them from point to point to ensure proper positioning. You think someone used the balloon string to align the Canon? It's a possibility worth considering. Miss Marple gathered the photographs carefully and placed them in a folder. I believe I should call on Agnes Reed again. She may be able to provide some additional information. The post office was quiet at this hour. Agnes looked up from sorting the afternoon mail with evident pleasure at the interruption. "Miss Marple, how nice. Have you come for stamps? Actually, Agnes, I hoped you might help me with another small matter. You mentioned that Mr. Dane collected a parcel from Birmingham. Did he mention what it contained?" "He said it was party supplies, something for the New Year's celebration." "I didn't pry, naturally. You did seem pleased with whatever it was. And you said he borrowed the post office typewriter last week." "Yes, on Wednesday. He needed to type some labels. He said his own typewriter was being repaired. I let him use the one in their back office. He was there for perhaps 20 minutes. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Did you happen to see the labels he typed?" "Not to read them, no. But I did notice they looked very professional official, almost like the sort of thing a hire company might use. And the typewriter he used, the post office machine, all its keys are in good working order?" Agnes looked slightly affronted. "Of course. I keep all the equipment in perfect condition. Why do you ask?" "Oh, no particular reason, though I understand Sir Lionel's office typewriter has a damaged. Why, yes, that wretched machine. I've typed envelopes for Edith Vale often enough when she's been overwhelmed with correspondence. The Y always comes out with a little chip at the top. Quite distinctive, really. I've suggested have it repaired, but Sir Lionel apparently felt it was an unnecessary expense. Miss Marple thanked Agnes and departed, her mind working rapidly. Dane had borrowed a typewriter in perfect working order, yet the label on the Canon case bore the distinctive chipped Y that belonged to Sir Lionel's office machine, not to any hire company or to the post office typewriter. That evening she received an unexpected visitor. Inspector Slack arrived just as was finishing her modest supper. Miss Marple, I've had a report from the Birmingham theatrical supplier. They confirm they sent a package to Mr. Dane 3 days ago, industrial blank cartridges, the sort used in starting pistols for theatrical productions. Perfectly legal to purchase, but decidedly dangerous if misused. Did Mr. Dane order them? That's just it. The order was placed by post with cashing closed. The handwriting on the order form doesn't match Mr. Dane's signature on file at the bank. We're having it analyzed, but it will take time. And the package was addressed to Mr. Dane's office. Yes, he collected it from the post office. As Agnes Reed confirmed, Miss Marple poured tea for the inspector, a ritual that somehow made conversation easier. Inspector, has it occurred to you that Mr. Dane might have been used as an innocent intermediary? That someone else ordered those blanks and arranged for them to present to his address, knowing he would collect them without question? Slack frowned. You're suggesting Summian framed him? Not framed, precisely. Simply used him as a convenient postal address. Mr. Dane is the sort of man who orders all manner of party supplies and theatrical effects. Another small package would excite no particular notice. But who would have access to collect the package after Dane received it? Someone who had a legitimate reason to be in his office, perhaps, or someone who could create such a reason. Slack set down his teacup with a decisive click. Miss Vale had access to Sir Lionel's office. She would have known about the chipped Y on the typewriter, and she's the sort of methodical person who would notice such details. She is indeed methodical. Miss Marple agreed, though, of course, other people might also have had access to that particular typewriter. One shouldn't jump to conclusions. But even as she spoke, she was thinking of Miss Vale's competence arranging tickets with precision, of her absence during the critical moments securing money in the safe of her gloves, which she claimed had acquired gun oil from wiping the tripod feet after midnight, though the marks on the polish had appeared before the cannon was fired. Small inconsistencies, perhaps, but in Miss Marple's experience, it was often the small inconsistencies that mattered most. The photographs Mr. Rifford took, she said carefully, showed the cannon's position changing between 11:57 and 11:58. Mr. Dane was visible at the microphone during that time, but someone else might have been behind the days making final adjustments, someone who knew exactly how to angle the cannon for maximum effect, someone with theatrical knowledge perhaps, or simply someone who had practiced the angle carefully beforehand. Using the chalk marks as guides, Slack rose to leave, his expression grim. I'll be interviewing Miss Vale again tomorrow, and this time I'll be asking some rather pointed questions about typewriters, gun oil, and exactly what she was doing in the minutes before the countdown. After he departed, Miss Marple sat for a long while in her chair, her knitting lying idle in her lap. The pieces were beginning to fit together, forming a picture of careful planning and cold-blooded execution. But motive remained unclear. Why would Edith Vale, after years of loyal service, murder her employer in such a dramatic and public fashion? There would be a reason, Miss Marple was certain. There was always Ariasinand with patience and observation. That reason would reveal itself. Chapter 7. Wrist smudge in red, gloves smelling of oil. Inspector Slack conducted his second interview with Miss Edith Vale in Sir Lionel's officer room. That spoke of masculine prosperity and a certain indifference to aesthetic refinement. Heavy oak furniture dominated the space, and filing cabinets lined one wall with military precision. Miss Marple had been invited to attend, though Slack would have been hard-pressed to explain precisely why. Perhaps it was her ability to notice details that escaped official observation. Perhaps it was simply that her presence seemed to encourage confidences. Miss Vale arrived punctually, her expression suggesting she regarded Thistlemans as yet another inefficient interruption. To necessary work, Inspector, I really must protest. Sir Lionel's affairs require immediate attention, and I have responsibilities to the estate. This won't take long, Miss Vale. Please sit down. She did so, removing her gloves with brisk, efficient movements, and placing them on the desk before her. They were grey kid leather, well made and meticulously maintained. Slack opened his notebook. I'd like to clarify a few points from your previous statement. You said you helped Mr. Bell wipe the tripod feet after midnight when they had marked the polish. Yes, Arthur was distressed about the marks. I offered to assist, yet, according to several witnesses, including Mr. Bell himself, those marks appeared before the cannon was fired. Mr. Rifford's photographs taken at 11:58 clearly showed the scuff in the polish. A faint colour touched Miss Vale's cheeks. Then I must have been mistaken about the timing. The evening was naturally quite confused. Miss Marple spoke from her position by the window, her tone mild. Perhaps you wiped the tripod feet at an earlier time when the cannon was first positioned. For instance, I may have done. I don't recall precisely. And yet, Miss Marple continued, you told us yesterday that you remained at the ticket table until 11:45, then went to secure the cash box. You couldn't have been near the cannon during its positioning at 4:30, and you were absent during the critical period before midnight. Miss Vale's fingers tightened on the arms of her chair. It must have helped Arthur at some other point during the preparations. These details blur together. Slack leaned forward. Miss Vale, we've examined your gloves, the ones you wore yesterday evening. They've been analyzed by our laboratory. My gloves, they contain traces of gun oil. Fresh gun oil, the same type found inside the cannon's tripod mechanism. How do you explain that? For the first time, Miss Vale's composure faltered. I told you I helped wipe the tripod. There must have been oil on the metal, but the oil was inside the mechanism, not on the exterior surface. One would need to open the tripod head to encounter it. A lengthy silence followed. Miss Marple observed Miss Vale's face, noting the way her jaw tightened, the slight tremor in her hands. Inspector, Miss Marple said gently, might he examine Miss Vale's gloves? Slack passed them across. Miss Marple held them delicately, bringing them close to her face and inhaling with the careful attention of a connoisseur assessing wine. Yes, gun oil, certainly, but also something else. A cleaning solvent, perhaps the sort one might use to remove other marks or stains. Miss Vale's lips pressed into a thin line. You see, Miss Marple continued, still in that gentle tone, I've been thinking about the sequence of events. The cannon was tampered with before it reached the assembly rooms. Somebody opened it, replaced the harmless confetti charge with blank cartridges and wadding, then resealed it so carefully that Mr. Bell suspected nothing when he collected it. That person would necessarily have handled the mechanical components. getting gun oil on their hands or gloves. Later, realizing this might be incriminating, they attempted to clean the gloves, but gun oil is persistent. It penetrates leather quite thorough. This is pure speculation, Miss Vale said. But her voice lacked conviction. Slack had been examining something else during this exchange. Miss Vale, could you roll up your sleeves, please? I beg your pardon? Your sleeves? Roll them up. With obvious reluctance, Miss Vale complied. Her wrists pale and thin bore a faint reddish smear on the right side, barely visible against her skin. Aniline dye, Slack said with satisfaction. The same dye used in the silver streamers. When they get damp, they shed color. You have a smear on your wrist, Miss Vale. The streamers were everywhere after the incident. Anyone might have acquired such marks, but you weren't present immediately after the incident. Miss Marple pointed out. You returned to Thel at 12:05 by your own account. By then, the streamers were scattered on the floor, not being handled. How did the dye transfer to your wrist? Miss Vale said nothing, unless Miss Marple continued. You handled the streamers at an earlier time when you were loading them into the cannon, perhaps along with blank cartridges. The streamers would have been damp from storage or from perspiration on nervous hands. Teddy would transfer easily. Slack produced another item from his folder. We've also located the order form for the blank cartridges. The handwriting has been analyzed. It matches samples taken from Sir Lionel's files documents that you typed and prepared for his signature. You disguised your hand, but certain characteristics remain consistent. Miss Vale's face had gone very white. Her hands, so capable and efficient now, trembled visibly in her lap. You ordered blanks using Mr. Dane's address, Slack pressed. You knew he received numerous parcels for party supplies, and wouldn't think twice about another package. You collected it probably when visiting his office on some pretext. You typed the fake hire label using Sir Lionel's typewriter with its distinctive chipped Y, making it appear the cannon came directly from the hire firm. You opened the cannon case, replaced the charge, and resealed it. When Mr. Bell collected it, everything appeared legitimate. Miss Marple's voice was very soft. And then at some point during the evening, you marked the floor with chalk to position Sir Lionel precisely. You may have even used the balloon string as a sight line, chalked it to ensure the angle was correct. Everything was prepared. All that remained was for Mr. Dane to pull the lanyard, which he did in perfect innocence. Miss Vale sat motionless, her face a mask. Then slowly she spoke. The gloves are mine. I did handle the cannon mechanism, but handling equipment is not murder. Inspector, combined with the analindi, the typewriter evidence, the parcel order, and your access to all the necessary components, it's quite sufficient. Slack replied firmly. You've built a circumstantial case, Miss Vale said, her voice steady despite her pallor. But you haven't established motive. Why would I, after years of loyal service, suddenly decide to murder Sir Lionel? That, Miss Marple said quietly, is indeed the question, isn't it? Though I suspect the answer lies somewhere in Sir Lionel's papers and accounts, perhaps. Or correspondence. Something that gave you both means and reason. Miss Vale stood abruptly. I will say nothing further without legal counsel. Slack nodded. That is your right, but I must ask you not to leave market basing until this matter is resolved. After Miss Vale departed, escorted by a constable, Slack turned Thomas Marple with grudging respect. The evidence is strong, but she's right about motive. We need to understand why she did it. We need to examine Sir Lionel's financial records. Miss Marple replied, and perhaps speak to Mrs. Markham about the nature of her husband's recent arrangements. I suspect we'll find that Miss Fallows' position had become rather less secure than it appeared. You think Sir Lionel planned to dismiss her? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that changes were afoot for someone who had devoted years to managing a man's affairs. Such changes might seem like betrayal, particularly if they threatened not just employment, but reputation as well. Chapter 8. Orders parcels, and a box with the wrong wadding. The following morning found Miss Marple and Inspector Slack in Sir Lionel's study, working through filing cabinets with the methodical attention the task required. Mrs. Clarissa Markham had granted permission for the search, though she herself had retreated to her sister-in-law's house, unable to face the rooms her husband had so recently occupied. Financial records going back 5 years, Slack muttered, pulling another folder from the cabinet. The man kept everything. Methodical record-keeping often reveals more than the keeper intended. Miss Marple observed. She was examining a ledger of household accounts, noting entries in Miss Fallows Bressai's handwriting. Dr. Haddock arrived mid-morning with additional information. I've been speaking with Sir Lionel's solicitor, Trent, apparently. There were recent changes to various arrangements. Sir Lionel married Mrs. Markham 8 months ago, and since then several adjustments were made. What sort of adjustments? Slack asked. Miss Fallows' position was being restructured. She was to be replaced after the new year by a younger woman, someone with what Sir Lionel called more social graces. Miss Vale was to be given a reference and a modest pension, but her access to the accounts will be terminated immediately. Miss Marple looked up sharply. She was being dismissed. Effectively, yes. Trent received the instructions in writing just before Christmas. The new secretary was to start on the 2nd of January. Did Miss Vale know? According to Trent, Sir Lionel planned to inform her after the New Year's celebration. He didn't want unpleasantness to mar the festivities. Slack's expression darkened. So she learned her years of service were to end with barely a month's notice. They're small. Haddock continued. Trent also mentioned a trust fund that Miss Vale co-managed with Sir Lionel. The Theos Beetle Wing construction. She was a co-signatory on the account necessary for releasing funds to contractors. Sir Lionel had withdrawn a substantial sum 3 weeks ago, some £5. Zero for what threatened a bridge investment. Miss Vale's signature was on the withdrawal authorization. A bridge investment. Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Speculative, apparently something to do with property development. Trent wasn't privy to the details, but he understood it was rather risky, and if it failed, the hospital fund would be short. Questions would be asked and Miss Vale's signature would be on the documents, authorizing the withdrawal. Miss Marple set down the ledger with deliberate care, so she faced not merely dismissal but potential scandal. Her reputation, built over years of impeccable service, would be destroyed. Agnes Reed arrived shortly before noon, slightly breathless from her bicycle ride. Inspector Slack, I found something. You should see the parcel record book. She produced a worn ledger from the post office, opening it to a marked page. Here 3 days before New Year's Eve. One parcel from Midland Stage Supply to Mr. Victor Dane. But there's also this entry 2 days earlier. A small package posted from here in Market Basing, addressed to that same Birmingham firm. Return address listed as Mr. Dane's office. Someone sent something to Birmingham before receiving a package from them. Slack frowned. The outgoing pack contained payment, Agnes explained. Cash by the weight and these and as notation. And the handwriting on the posting form matches other samples I've seen in Sir Lionel's office files. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Miss Vale sent cash payment for the blank cartridges using Mr. Dane's return address. to avoid suspicion. The Birmingham firm then sent the goods to that same address, a tidy arrangement and one that would direct no suspicion toward her. In the afternoon, Arthur Bell arrived at the study with a discovery of his own. "Inspector, I was clearing out the caretaker's cupboard, and I found this tucked behind the cleaning supplies." He produced a cardboard box approximately 8 inches square bearing the printed label of a theatrical supplier. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, were layers of soft wadding printed with blue stars. "That's confetti wadding," Slack observed. "For the cannon?" "It should be, sir. But when I helped Mr. Dane test the cannon earlier in the week, he showed me the charge that came with it. This looks like that original packing, but there's something odd in the dustbin." He produced a second box similar in size, but differently marked. This one had contained heavier stock, and inside were stiff grey cardboard discs precisely cut. One space in the arrangement was empty. Miss Marple examined both boxes carefully. The original confetti charge used soft tissue wadding, harmless even at close range. But someone substituted these grey discs instead, denser cardboard, compressed and hard. At close range, driven by a blank cartridge, they would be lethal. "Where did the second box come from?" Slack demanded. Bell shook his head. "Wasn't there when I placed the cannon, sir. Must have been brought in later and the charger swapped. Then whoever did it hid the original in my cupboard and put the grey wadding box in the bin, likely expect. Think it would be cleared away after the celebration." Slack examined the second box more closely. On the bottom, in faint pencil, was a notation, "Industrial-grade stage nail gun use." "Miss Vale would have known about such things," Miss Marple said quietly. Sir Lionel's investments included construction projects. She would have been familiar with industrial tools, including the powder-actuated devices used to drive fasteners into concrete. The blanks for those tools are readily available from theatrical suppliers, whose similar charges for stage effects. So she ordered industrial blanks, received them at Dane's address, typed a false label using Sir Lionel's typewriter with the chipped Y, opened the cannon, substituted the lethal wadding for the harmless confetti, and resealed it so perfectly that Bell suspected nothing, all while ensuring she had an alibi. For the actual moment of firing, Miss Marple added, she was securing money in the safe when Mr. Dane pulled the lanyard. She couldn't have prevented the cannon from firing, even if she'd changed her mind. Dr. Haddock, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "But surely such planning suggests premeditation of the coldest sort. To spend weeks arranging a man's death, all while maintaining the appearance of devoted service, desperation," Miss Marple said softly, "can drive people to extraordinary lengths. Miss Vale faced ruin, not merely loss of position, but destruction of reputation. If Sir Lionel's investment failed, she would be held accountable for funds she hadn't truly authorized. She would be dismissed without a proper reference, perhaps even prosecuted. Everything she had worked for would be destroyed. So she killed him before he could dismiss her." Slack concluded grimly. "She killed him," Miss Marple corrected gently, "before he could ruin her. There's a distinction, though not one the law recognizes." Slack gathered the boxes, the ledgers. "The parcel records. We have means, opportunity, and motive. The case is as complete as it's likely to be." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, though I suspect Miss Vale would argue. She had no choice, that Sir Lionel's actions left her no alternative but to strike first. "We always have choices," Haddock said firmly. "Yes, Doctor, we do. But sometimes the choices available to us seem so narrow, so impossible, that desperation blinds us to any path except the one that leads to darkness." She thought of Edith Vale, efficient and capable, spending years managing another person's life while her own narrowed to little more than service and duty, and then, faced with betrayal and ruin, choosing murder as the only solution to an impossible situation. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a very human tragedy which didn't excuse it, but perhaps explained it better. Simple wickedness could. Chapter 9. The balloon string tied. Twice, Lady Bantry arrived at Miss Marple's cottage the next morning with an air of suppressed excitement quite unusual for her. "Jane, I've been thinking about those decorations at the assembly rooms. Something's been nagging at me since the evening, and I've finally worked out what it is." Miss Marple set aside her knitting with interest. "Do tell." "Dolly, it's the balloon arch over the days. You'll remember it? Surely. Silver and gold balloons arranged in a lovely curve suspended by strings from the ceiling beams. I recall it. Yes. Well, I was there yesterday afternoon with the committee helping to clear away the decorations. Most distressing work. Really taking down all those festive things with Sir Lionel barely cold, but it had to be done. And where I was unhooking the balloon strings, I noticed something peculiar." Lady Bantry paused for effect, clearly pleased with herself. One of the strings should been retied. The knot was quite different from all the others, newer, you see, and there was chalk dust on it. "Jane, just as you noticed in that photograph." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Show me which string." "Dolly, I brought it with me. Thought you might want to examine it properly." Lady Bantry produced a length of white cord from her capacious handbag, handling it as though it were evidence in a murder trial, which indeed it was. The string was perhaps 6 feet long, with a balloon clip at one end and a knot at the other. The knot was neat, but distinctly fresher than the weathered appearance of the rest of the cord, which had clearly been used for multiple decorating occasions, and there, faint but unmistakable, was a chalky residue near the knot. "May I borrow this, Dolly? I should like Inspector Slack to see it. Of course, I told the committee I'd dispose of it properly, so officially it's rubbish. Anyway." Within the hour, Miss Marple and Lady Bantry were at the assembly rooms with Inspector Slack, examining the ceiling beams above the dais. The balloon arch was suspended from hooks in the ceiling. Arthur Bell explained, having been summoned to provide technical details. "We install them every year for the big celebrations. The strings are meant to hang straight down with the balloon set at intervals. That this particular string," Miss Marple indicated the position where Lady Bantry had found the retied cord, "hung directly over the chalk star on the floor theon where Sir Lionel stood." Bell scratched his head. "Well, yes, I suppose it did, though I can't say I paid particular attention at the time. The string was chalked," Miss Marple continued. "An old theatrical technique, I understand. Stagehands used chalk lines to mark sight lines and positions. If one wanted to ensure a particular angle from ceiling to floor, one might chalk a string, stretch it taut, and use it as agwid." Slack was beginning to understand. "You're saying someone used this string to align the cannon, to make ascertain it pointed exactly at the spot where Lionel would stand. It's a possibility worth considering. Look here at the position of the hook. It's directly above where the chalk star was drawn, and if one were to stretch a chalk string from this hook down to the star, then use that line to angle the cannon barrel, one could achieve a remarkably precise aim." "But the cannon was pointing upward," Bell protested. "It appeared to be pointing upward," Miss Marple corrected gently. "But appearances can be deceiving, particularly in dim lighting. And Mr. Riffort's photographs show that the cannon's position shifted slightly between 11:57 and 11:58. Someone made a final adjustment." Lady Bantry, following the trajectory with her eyes, suddenly gasped. Jane, you're saying someone stretched this string from the ceiling hook down to the floor mark, used it to sight the cannon's angle, and then retied it to the hook so it would simply hang there as part of the decoration? Precisely. It's quite clever, really. The balloon string served a double purpose, first as a chalked sight line during preparation. Then, once the angle was confirmed, it was retied and the balloon reattached so it appeared perfectly innocent. Slack was examining the knot with new attention. This would require someone with theatrical knowledge, someone who understood stagger mechanics and sight lines, or someone who had observed such techniques. Miss Marple suggested, Sir. Lionel's business include theatrical investments. I believe Miss Vale would have handled correspondence with theatre managers, contractors, stage designers. She would have learned such methods through mere exposure. She had access to chalk from Sir Lionel's office, Slack added, warming to theory. Chalk for marking documents, making notations on plans simplest good, and chalk the sort that leaves exactly this kind of residue. Miss Marple walked slowly from the position of the hook to where the chalk star had been drawn. The string would have hung in a straight line taut. Someone could stand at the cannon and use that line to gauge the angle, precisely a few degrees lower than one might expect for a device meant to shower streamers upward, but not so low as to be immediately obvious. And the star on the floor ensured Sir Lionel stood in exactly the right position, Slack concluded. Mr. Dane placed him there thinking it was merely a good spot for the spotlight. He had no idea he was positioning the victim for murder. Arthur Bell looked stricken. I polished those floors so carefully. Never thought Simeon would use my clean parquet for such evil purposes. You couldn't have known. Mr. Bell, Miss Marple assured him kindly. The mark appeared innocent enough for stage manager's positioning, not easily explained, and quickly forgotten. Lady Bantry was still holding the string, turning it over in her hands. How long would this preparation have taken, drawing the star, chalking the string, testing the angle? Not long, Miss Marple replied. Perhaps 10 minutes of privacy at the right moment. Miss Vale was in and out of the assembly rooms all week, helping with preparations. She could have marked the floor during any of those visits, perhaps while checking the microphone placement, or consulting with Mr. Dane about arrangements. The chalk star was small enough to escape casual notice. And a string? Slack asked. That would have required access to the day's area. Shortly before the event, but after the balloons were in place, perhaps. During the final hour of preparation, when the hall was busy, but not yet crowded, a woman with a balloon in one hand and a piece of chalk in her pocket would attract no attention whatsoever. Slack made careful notes, his expression grim. Every detail planned, every contingency considered. The woman thought of everything. Not quite everything, Miss Marple said softly. She couldn't account for an elderly lady with too much curiosity and a magnifying glass, or for a young photographer with a passion for recording every moment, or for a caretaker who notices when his polish is scuffed. The smallest details, Inspector, are often the ones that solveth largest crimes. She looked up at the hook in the ceiling, then down at the scuffed boards where Sir Lionel had fallen. A straight line between them, marked first by chalk and string, then be blood and consequence. Shall we speak with Miss Vale again? Slack suggested. Present her with this additional evidence. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, though I suspect she already knows a carefully construed theatre has been dismantled piece by piece, string by string, one might say. Lady Bantry shuddered. How perfectly horrid to stand there all evening knowing what would happen at midnight, knowing she'd arranged every detail for murder, Yes, Miss Marple said quietly, though I imagine the horror came earlier. Dolly, when she first realized what Sir Lionel intended, when she understood that her years of faithful service counted for nothing against his new wife's preferences and his own financial recklessness. The murder itself was merely the culmination of a desperation that had been building for months. That doesn't excuse it, Slack said firmly. No, Inspector, it doesn't, but it does explain it. And in my experience, understanding why people do terrible things is nearly as important as proving that they did them. Chapter 10, Assembly Rooms. Lanyard, Watt, and the lady who placed the star. The assembly rooms had a somber quality in the grey afternoon light, stripped now of its festive decorations. Inspector Slack had assembled the principal figures on the days, where just days before Sir Lionel Markham had met his death. Miss Marple sat quietly to one side, her hands folded over her handbag. She had not sought this gathering, but when Slack suggested that her presence might encourage a full confession, she had agreed. Justice, she believed, was better served by truth than by legal manoeuvring. Present were Miss Edith Vale, accompanied by her solicitor, Mrs. Clarissa Markham, pale but composed, Victor Dane, his theatrical confidence much diminished, Arthur Bell, looking deeply uncomfortable, Hugh Rifford, with his camera, though Slack had forbidden any photographs, and Dr. Haddock, who had asked to attend in his capacity as the examining physician. Lady Bantry had positioned herself near Miss Marple, and several committee ladies occupied chairs at the back, unable to resist witnessing the conclusion of Market Basing's most shocking crime. Inspector Slack began without preamble. We're here because the evidence in Sir Lionel Markham's death is now complete. What appeared to be natural causes was in fact carefully premeditated murder. Miss Marple has been instrumental in uncovering the truth. I'll ask her to explain what happened. Miss Marple rose, moving Toston near the brass cannon, which remained as evidence. The method was theatrical. She began, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet room. A blank cartridge fired at close range can kill. The wadding itself becomes a projectile capable of penetrating flesh. This cannon was hired legitimately, but Simeon altered it before it reached these rooms. The harmless confetti charge was replaced with industrial blank cartridges and dense cardboard wadding. At midnight, when Mr. Dane pulled Thalanyarden, innocent good faith both streamers and lethal wadding were discharged. Sir Lionel, standing precisely positioned on a chalk mark, received the impact directly over his heart. She paused, looking at each foreseen turn. The clues were numerous. First, the sulphurous smell of propellant too heavy for mere confetti. Second, the cardboard disc lodged in Sir Lionel's buttonhole singed at the edges. Third, the chalk star marking his position and therited balloon string above chalked to create a sight line for aiming the cannon. Fourth, the cannon's breech-owing screw marks where it had been opened and gun oil inside the mechanism. Fifth, to boxes the original with soft tissue wadding, the substitute with grey industrial discs. Victor Dane shifted June comfortably. But I hired the cannon. Are you suggesting I'm responsible? No. Mr. Dane, you were used as an innocent intermediary. The industrial blanks were ordered and sent to your address because the killer knew. You received numerous theatrical supplies and wouldn't question another parcel. You collected it from the post office, never suspecting its true purpose. The label on the cannon case was crucial, Slack interjected. It appeared to be from the hire firm, but Thetty Priter used had a distinctive, flora-chipped Y that Y belonged to. Sir Lionel's office typewriter not to any hire company or to the post office machine Mr. Dane had borrowed for his legitimate labels. Miss Marple nodded. Mr. Rifford's photograph showed Thecannon's position shifting between 11:57 and 11:58. Someone made final adjustments to Thingle just before midnight, and that person had gun oil on their gloves and aniline dye from handling damp streamers in their wrist. These marks appeared before the cannon was fired, not after. All eyes turned to Miss Vale, who sat rigid in her chair, her solicitor whispering urgently in her ear. The motive, Miss Marple continued gently, was desperation born of betrayal. Miss Vale had served Sir Lionel faithfully for years. She managed his affairs, maintained his accounts, became essential to his life. Then he married and everything changed. His new wife preferred a younger secretary with social graces. Miss Vale was to be dismissed after the New Year's celebration. Mrs. Markham looked stricken. "I never demanded such a thing." Lionel made the decision himself, perhaps. Miss Marple acknowledged, but Miss Vale faced more than mere dismissal. Sir Lionel had withdrawn £5,000 from the hospital trust fund for a speculative investment. Miss Vale's signature authorized the withdrawal. If the investment failed, questions would be asked. Her reputation, built over decades of impeccable service, would be destroyed. She would be dismissed without references, perhaps even prosecuted, left with nothing. Dr. Haddock spoke quietly. So, she decided to strike first. She planned carefully. She ordered the industrial blanks using Dane's single quotes S address, sending cash payment to avoid a paper trail connected to herself. She typed a false hire libelling Sir Lionel's typewriter, creating the appearance that the cannon came directly from Birmingham, sealed and certified. She opened the cannon, replaced the charge, resealed it so perfectly that Mr. Bell suspected nothing when he collected it. Arthur Bell nodded miserably. "It looked completely legitimate, Miss Marple. I never thought to question it." "Of course you didn't. That was the brilliance of the plan." During the week of preparations, Miss Vale marked the floor with a small chalk star, positioning it where Sir Lionel would stand for his toast. She chalked a balloon string to create a sight line from ceiling to floor, testing the angle until it was perfect. On the evening itself, she made final adjustments, ensuring the cannon was aimed precisely. Then she secured the cash box in the safe, creating an alibi for the actual moment of firing. While Mr. Dane pulled the lanyard, she was elsewhere, apparently innocent. The room was utterly silent. Miss Vale sat motionless, her face a careful blank. Slack produced the evidence stewarding boxes. The chalked string, the photographs, the gloves with traces of gun oil. "Miss Vale," he said formally, "do you wish to respond to these allegations?" For a long moment she said nothing. Then very quietly she spoke. "He was a coward. He used my knowledge, my signature, my years of devoted service. Then he planned to cast me aside and leave me ruined. He called it restructuring. I called it betrayal." Her solicitor placed a restraining hand on her arm, but she shook it off. "I did everything for him, everything. And in return, he would have destroyed my name, my livelihood, my entire future. So, yes, Inspector, I planned it carefully. I executed it precisely. A blank cartridge, properly aimed, kills as surely as a bullet. The confetti was merely decoration." Mrs. Markham had begun to weep silently. Victor Dane stared at Miss Vale as though seeing her for the first time. Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. "Men are often cowards, my dear, but murder is never the answer to cowardice." "What else could I do?" Miss Vale asked, and for the first time, emotion cracked through her composure. "He left me no choice. No choice at all." "We always have choices," Miss Marple replied softly. though I grant you sometimes the alternatives seem impossible to bear. Inspector Slack stood. Edith Vale, I am arresting you for the murder of Sir Lionel Markham. As the constables led her away, Miss Vale looked back once at the days at Thecannon at the place where her careful planning had culminated in death. Annesley New Year, Miss Marple, Slack said quietly. Lady Bantry shivered. Next year we shall see in the new year with tea and no cannons. Miss Marple collected her handbag and gloves, a very safe custom, Dolly. And if one must mark the floor, let it be for a waltz, not a funeral. They walked out into the winter afternoon, leaving the assembly rooms to their silence. Behind them, the Broscanons stood as mute testimony to how easily festivity could become tragedy when desperation drove someone to transform celebration into death. Murder, Miss Marple reflected, was always a failure of imagination. Miss Vale could imagine elaborate mechanical tricks, but couldn't imagine a life beyond Sir Lionel's service. And that failure, more than any blank cartridge chalked sight line, was the true cause of the tragedy that had transformed a New Year's celebration into a scene of calculated killing.